All right, hey everyone. If you're aiming for that IAS, this deep dive is going to be super relevant for you. We're going to be talking about transgender rights in India, and this is important for both mains and prelims.
Yes, and more specifically, we're going to be focusing on a landmark 2024 Karnataka High Court ruling that deals with birth certificate revisions for transgender individuals.
This case, I think, really brings up a lot of interesting questions about the Transgender Persons Act of 2019 and how, self-identification plays out in the real world.
Absolutely, and especially, for someone like Mrs. X, who actually went to court to try to update her birth certificate, this really exemplifies some of the challenges that transgender individuals in India still face, even with progressive legislation like the 2019 Act.
So maybe we should start by just sort of like unpacking the 2019 Act a little bit. I mean, it was a huge step forward, wasn't it?
It was a huge step forward. For
Yeah.
the first time, transgender people in India had this legal recognition, right? So the act gives a legal definition of what it means to be transgender, and it also grants them the right to self-declared gender identity.
And that's huge because, I mean, before that, their identities were often questioned or just like completely denied, right?
Exactly. And with the act, this right to self-identification is backed up with like an actual legal document.
Oh, yeah, you're talking about the certificate of identity.
That's right, the certificate of identity.
Right.
It's issued by the district magistrate, and it basically says, hey, this is who this person is, this is their gender identity. And that has huge implications for things like updating their Aadhaar card, passport, driver's license, even birth certificates.
Okay, so that brings us to the heart of Mrs. X's case, right? She had a reassignment surgery and she wanted to update her birth certificate. But the existing law, the one from way back in 1969, the Registration of Births and Deaths Act, it didn't seem to allow for that kind of change.
Yeah, that's the conflict here. The 1969 Act was written in a time when, like, these kinds of things weren't even really considered. And so it only allows for corrections, like if there's a clerical error or, like, outright fraud.
So Miss X's situation, even though it was totally valid, it just didn't fit into those neat little boxes.
Exactly. It kind of exposed this gap between, having progressive legislation like the 2019 Act, but then also having these older laws that hadn't really caught up with the changing times and our understanding of gender identity.
So it was like a bureaucratic nightmare for Miss X.
Yeah, it was definitely a big obstacle for her, and that's where the Karnataka High Court had to step in.
And they made a pretty landmark ruling, right? Like, what did they actually say?
The High Court basically said, look, the 2019 Act is a specific law that is meant to protect transgender rights. So it trumps the general provisions of that older 1969 Act.
So, like, the 2019 Act is the boss here.
Yeah, exactly. They were using this legal principle called generalia specialibus non derogant, which I know sounds super complicated, but it basically means that when you have a specific law that clashes with a general law, the specific one wins. And then they went on to say that the registrar has to update birth certificates if someone has a certificate of identity under the 2019 Act. Can you imagine how validating that must have been for Mrs. X?
To finally have her identity recognized on her birth certificate. Yeah, I bet that was huge. And this ruling, it doesn't just impact Miss X, right? It sets a precedent for other transgender individuals in India.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge win for the transgender community. This Karnataka High Court decision can influence similar cases in other states, and it could even pave the way for changing that old 1969 Act so that it doesn't create roadblocks for transgender people.
This is all really great to hear, but I do wonder about the practical side of things. We can have great laws, but if they don't actually get implemented, it doesn't really help anyone, right?
That's the key. Having a law is just the first step. We need to make sure that it actually makes a difference in the lives of transgender people.
So let's dig into the details. How does all this actually work in practice? Like if someone wants to get their documents updated, what do they have to do?
Okay, so the first thing they need is that certificate of identity that we were talking about. And to get that, they need to apply to the district magistrate with an affidavit declaring their self-identified gender.
And then the DM just hands over the certificate, right?
Well, not exactly. It's a bit of a process. The DM reviews everything, assigns an identification number, and then within 30 days, they either issue the certificate along with a transgender identity card, or they reject the application. But they have to give reasons if they do that.
So there's some level of accountability built into this system.
There is. Now, what if someone has already had gender reassignment surgery? How does that work?
I'm guessing they need to provide some kind of medical documentation.
Right. They would need a certificate from a certified medical professional verifying that they've had the surgery, and then they can use that to apply for a revised certificate of identity.
Okay, and how long does it take to get that revised certificate?
The Act says it should be done within 15 days.
That's good. At least it's a pretty quick turnaround. Now, what about people who transitioned before the 2019 Act even existed? Do they have to go through this whole process too?
No, they actually don't. If they already legally changed their gender on official documents before 2019, those documents are still recognized and they don't need to apply for a new certificate.
That makes sense. It would be kind of unfair to make them jump through all these hoops when they already knew they needed to do.
Exactly. It's important to consider those who transitioned before the specific legal framework was in place.
So, okay, let's say you have your certificate of identity in hand. How do you actually get your other documents updated, like your Aadhaar card or educational certificates?
Well, that's where that 15-day rule comes in again. The Act says that any authority that's responsible for those kinds of documents has to update the name, gender, any relevant information within 15 days of getting an application and a copy of the certificate of identity.
So, at least on paper, it seems like they've tried to streamline the process and make it efficient.
That's definitely the intention, but as we know, the reality can sometimes be a little bit more complicated. And we'll talk about some of those potential challenges a little later on.
Yeah, I'm definitely curious to hear about that. But before we move on, I think it's worth highlighting that that 15-day time frame, it's not just an arbitrary number, right?
It's not. I think it speaks to this sense of urgency, like recognizing transgender individuals' rights and making sure that they're not facing unnecessary delays or hurdles in just living their lives authentically.
So it seems like we have this really good legal framework in place to support transgender rights. But like you said, now we need to make sure it actually works for the people that it's supposed to help.
Yeah. Exactly. Having the law is just the first step. What really matters is whether it actually leads to real improvements in the lives of transgender individuals.
So where do you see the potential roadblocks? I mean, we talked about how like older laws can sometimes clash with these newer ones, but what are some of the other challenges that you see?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is just awareness, right? You can have the most progressive laws on the books, but if people, especially those officials who are actually implementing them, if they're not aware of these laws, then they become meaningless.
You mean like, if a transgender person goes to update their documents and the official has no idea about the process or the rights under the 2019 Act?
Exactly. And even if there is awareness, there could be resistance or just plain prejudice, which can make the process really difficult. We have to remember that deeply ingrained societal attitudes can take a long time to change, even when the law has moved forward.
That makes me think about, some of the stories we hear about women trying to access their property rights or political reservations. The laws are there, but the societal norms and practical challenges, they can create these like invisible barriers.
That's a really good comparison, and it really highlights why we need this multi-pronged approach. Strong laws are important, but we also need massive public awareness campaigns, sensitivity training for officials, and a continuous effort to change hearts and minds.
It's almost like, when you're building a bridge,
Mm-hmm.
you need a strong foundation, which is the law in this case, but you also need the pillars and cables to actually make it functional.
I love that analogy. And even with the best intentions, bureaucratic systems can be really slow and complex. We need to simplify the processes, make sure that different departments are coordinating effectively, and have systems in place for people to complain if things aren't working properly.
So, for our listeners out there who are planning to take the UPSC exams, this case isn't just a legal problem to solve, right? It's about understanding how social change happens and how law, society, and the administrative system all kind of intersect.
Yeah, that's a really great point. This case is like a goldmine of insights for any aspiring IAS officer. It's about understanding how these legal frameworks interact with societal attitudes and the practical challenges of making them work in the real world.
It's also about remembering that behind every legal case, there's a human story.
Yeah.
Mystic X's case wasn't just about a birth certificate. It was about her right to live with dignity and have her identity recognized.
And I think that human element is something that any public servant needs to keep in mind. Laws and policies aren't just abstract concepts. They have a real impact on people's lives, on their sense of self, and their ability to participate in society.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about the legal stuff, the court ruling, and the challenges of actually making things work. Is there anything else about the Transgender Persons Act that our listeners should know, like any of the nitty-gritty details?
Yeah, actually, there is. Let's go back to the application process for a second. Remember how we talked about how people who transitioned before the 2019 Act don't need to apply for a new certificate?
Yeah, their existing documents are still valid, right?
Exactly. It's almost like a grandfather clause. It protects the rights of those who transitioned before this specific legal framework was created.
So for our UPSC folks, if you see a question about someone who transitioned before 2019 and whether they need a new certificate of identity, the answer is no, they don't.
Yep, you got it. It's these little details, these nuances in the law that can really make a difference in those exams.
It's not just about memorizing stuff. It's about really understanding how it applies in different situations.
Exactly. And that deeper understanding comes from actually engaging with the material, asking questions, and thinking about what it means in the real world.
Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about what happens after someone applies to update their documents. We know there's that 15-day deadline, but let's be realistic. How often does that actually happen?
You're bringing up a really important point. The law might set a specific time frame, but enforcing it can be a whole other story.
So what are some of the things that could cause delays or problems?
It could be anything from bureaucratic red tape, just plain inefficiency, to a lack of awareness or training among those officials who are supposed to be handling these applications. And unfortunately, sometimes it's just intentional resistance or prejudice.
So what can a transgender person do if they hit those roadblocks? They're already navigating this complex system, and then to face more hurdles on top of that, it's just not right.
You're right, it's not. It's so important for them to be aware of their rights and to know where to go if they need help. If an official is delaying things for no good reason, they can file a complaint.
Where would they complain to? Is there a specific place that deals with these kinds of issues?
It really depends on the situation and the specific department that's involved. It might be the head of that department or a grievance redressal mechanism within that organization. Sometimes it could even be a human rights commission. And there are also a lot of NGOs out there that focus on transgender rights, and they can provide legal aid and support.
So knowing where to go for help is just as important as knowing the law itself.
Absolutely. And this is where having a deep understanding of how the administrative system works is so valuable, especially for those who are thinking about joining the IAS. It's about knowing how to navigate the bureaucracy, how to advocate for people who are being marginalized, and making sure that justice is actually served.
It's about using your position of power to help those who don't have that power.
Well said. And that's really what public service is all about, isn't it? It's about using the law to do good and ensuring that everyone's rights are protected.
We've talked about a lot today, starting with the legal details of the Transgender Persons Act and then kind of getting into the real world challenges of actually putting it all into practice. But before we wrap up, I'm curious to get your perspective on the bigger picture here. I mean, what does this ruling and the whole movement for transgender rights tell us about where India is headed?
I think it's a really powerful sign that India is changing, both legally and socially. The Karnataka High Court's decision, even the 2019 Act itself, they reflect this growing awareness of the rights and dignity of transgender people. It feels like we're moving toward a more inclusive and just society.
It's like we're finally acknowledging that everyone has the right to be who they are, regardless of their gender identity.
Exactly. And this kind of recognition, it has a ripple effect. It forces us to look at traditional ideas about gender and identity in a new light, to challenge those old norms. And it's not just happening in India, this is a global conversation.
Yeah, for sure. So for those of you listening who are getting ready for the UPSC exams, remember, this isn't just some abstract topic to study. This is about engaging with some of the most important social issues of our time.
Absolutely. Understanding the legal framework is essential, but it's equally important to understand the social, cultural, and even economic implications of these changes.
Speaking of economic implications, is there any research on how recognizing transgender rights might actually benefit India's economy?
There is, and it's growing. More and more studies are showing that inclusive societies tend to be more prosperous. When you allow everyone to participate fully, you tap into this huge pool of talent and potential.
It's like we're finally recognizing the contributions of a whole segment of the population that has been ignored for far too long.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And it's not just about the economics. It's about building a society where everyone feels valued and respected.
Okay, so before we go, let's do a quick recap for our listeners, especially for those UPSC aspirants out there. We started today by diving into the Transgender Persons Act of 2019, which was a major turning point in India's legal history.
And we talked about how that act guarantees the right to self-identified gender for transgender individuals. And not just that, but it also requires that this gender identity be reflected on all official documents including birth certificates. Then we looked at the case of Miss X, which really showed us how this progressive law could bump up against older laws that don't really address gender identity in a meaningful way.
And the Karnataka High Court's ruling in Mrs. X's favor was really important, right? It basically said that specific laws that protect the rights of marginalized groups like the transgender community, they take precedence over more general provisions in older laws.
Exactly. And then we talked about the process of applying for a certificate of identity, which is that crucial document that allows transgender people to update their official records.
And we talked about that 15-day deadline, the one where the authorities have to update those documents.
Hmm.
But we also acknowledged that there are definitely some challenges when it comes to making sure that actually happens, and the need for strong systems to handle complaints when things go wrong.
We even touched on the bigger implications of all these changes, like how promoting inclusion could actually have economic benefits for India, and how important things like awareness campaigns and sensitivity training are in truly creating a more inclusive society.
Yeah, this deep dive hasn't just been about the law, it's been about the people and the stories behind it all, the real changes that are happening in society.
That's right. And I think it leaves us with a lot to think about. So as we wrap up today, I want to leave our listeners with a question. We've seen progress, but there's still work to be done. What steps can India take to really become a global leader in protecting the rights of transgender people?
That's a really great question to end on. It reminds us that the fight for equality doesn't end here. It takes continued effort and a willingness to keep learning and challenging the status quo.
I couldn't agree more.
And to all our awesome UPSC aspirants out there, keep in mind that understanding these issues and really grappling with them, it's not just about passing exams, it's about shaping the future of India.
Absolutely.
And if you like this deep dive, hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. We'll be back with more deep dives on topics that matter, helping you understand the world and ace those UPSC exams. Until then, keep learning, keep asking those tough questions, and keep working towards a better, more just world for everyone.